Welcome all our viewers on this edition of Jaipur Dialogues. Today we have two very distinguished guests. Of course, I think everybody recognizes Dr. Frawley here because Dr. Frawley is virtually our founder member and has been with us right from the day we started. And for the newcomers who join us, Dr. Frawley is an expert in Vedas and Vedantas, yoga, and all in the tradition of Raman Maharshi. And he is not just a theoretician, he is one who believes and practices the experiential path to Vedas, Vedantas, and yoga. Also has introduced a Vedic institution in US, and is a frequent visitor to India to a number of dialogues and talk sessions and events in India, and is a regular on Jaipur Dialogues Forum. Dr. Subhash Kak is here for the first time. Welcome, Dr. Subhash Kak, to Jaipur Dialogues. Dr. Subhash Kak is Regents Professor of Computer Science in Oklahoma University at Stillwater. And last year, he was also inducted as a member on the what is called PM STIAC, Prime Minister's Science, Technology, and Innovation Advisory Council. And for the doubters, he is also a visiting professor of engineering at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. So he wears many hats, a very, very distinguished career. And I have learned quantum mechanics a little bit, whatever little I could, from Dr. Subhash Kak. And I have been very impressed by his forays into Nyaya Shastra and Vaisheshik particularly. The way he brought out Vaisheshik to me was greatly revealing. His analysis of Veda, Vedanta, yoga, also a very, very scientific and very, very rational perspective that anybody can understand, especially the ones who want to follow the path of what is called, I have divided the three paths, the Bhakti Marg, the Jnana Marg, and the Yoga Marg. And the Jnana Marg, I say that Jnana Marg, Buddhi Madhyam, and Tarka Tattva. So that is what Dr. Subhash Kak brings to us. Today in this first dialogue, the background is the Corona pandemic. Now, that Corona pandemic is something that affects all of us in some way or the other, whether we are directly affected or indirectly affected, whether directly fighting it, we are Corona warriors, or we are just sitting and quarantining at home. The social relationships and the relationships between the state and the society, the relationships between the state and the individuals are all getting redefined, as has happened during any epoch-making event, whether it happened in the Second World War or it happened during the Communist Revolution, or even earlier in the French Revolution, or before that, the Treaty of Westphalia, or even earlier when we had the Cartesian theory coming up and then the social theorists following it up with what is called the individual rights theory. So I request Dr. Subhash Kak to go first. Do we see a fundamental alteration of these relationships, intra-society, between society and individual, and between the individual and the state?
Thank you, Sanjay ji. I'm delighted to be a part of the dialogues. And let me just say that what the coronavirus thing has done is only accelerate a process which is a consequence of historic, unprecedented changes being brought about by technology, brought about by pervasive automation, which some people call AI. So it was expected, perhaps in the next 10, 20 years, that a lot of the jobs will go away and society and the elites and the leaders will have to worry about what to do, how to keep social concord, how to make sure that people are able to live life with dignity. Because if people don't have jobs, and even if you give them a certain amount of money, which has been called universal basic income, that would perhaps not be a utopia. It will, as people have called, it'll be a kind of a dystopic situation. So now what the coronavirus thing has done is to accelerate or telescope that process into just a period of a few months. In fact, both people from the right and the left uh, uh, surprisingly, are quite not shocked, so to speak, by the government, certainly in the West, doing things which the government had not done in the past. For example, the whole thing about quarantining, especially in the US, where there's a lot of weight given to individual rights. So there have been points of crisis, of tension. But stepping back, I think people will, given that this whole massive unemployment that people expect to occur in, certainly in the West, there are estimates that the US and unemployment rate might go up to 35% or something. Right now, it's already in the mid-teens, when a few months ago it was just 3 or 4%. So fundamental things are happening in the West, in Europe, and part of this, of course, has been the asymmetry in manufacturing and consumption, with China becoming the manufacturing hub of the world and creating asymmetry at so many different levels, which have led to social tensions and political tensions as well in various countries, where people feel that they have lost control of unfoldment of events. So all of that has happened, but in my view, there have been equally disruptive events. In some ways, this event is unprecedented, and that's because of technology. But if one were to step back and look at the 1917, 1918 influenza pandemic, which is called Spanish flu, in which, according to different estimates, about 100 million people died. And a large fraction of that, 30 or 40 million people, were from the Indian subcontinent. So terrible things have happened in history from time to time. The Black Death in Europe, for example, where 1/3 of the population died a few centuries ago. But societies and human beings are resilient. They have the capacity to spring back into a new normalcy, and all these bad events are forgotten. Perhaps the most dramatic instance from history of such a change is India from the late 18th century, let's say 1770s or 80s, when India's share of the world economy was about 25%, to 1914, when it had shrunk to 1.4%. So 19th century was a century of horrors, and it was horrors which took place in a slow pace, so that people didn't quite know what was happening. It's like what is called the boiling frog paradox. You put a frog in hot water, it will immediately jump out. But if you put a frog in cold water and slowly heat it, the frog will never think of jumping out of that water. And that's what happened to India. There were famines. There was one community pitted against another because there was not enough food to go around. This is what the British did by ensuring that there were no investments in manufacturing in India, and they became suppliers to India. And so even in spite of that, because of the amazing system that we have in India, system related to what the nature of humanity is, what the nature of society is, the whole idea of dharma as something on which everybody stands, where Dhri is also from Dhara, earth, or the ground, where society stands, what society stands on. So I think India is much better placed than many other nations because of its social, intellectual, and psychological and spiritual capital. Maybe many other countries are not, and not because they did not have some of these capitals themselves. The West had its own spiritual tradition, but in the last 40, 50 years, they've sort of jettisoned it, and everything has been done only for the body, for exchange, for transactions, physical transactions. And one cannot live by food and body and clothes alone. And we see examples of that in the horrific um, opioid epidemic in the US and possibly in Europe as well, where 60, 70,000 people are killing themselves. These are people, wonderfully educated in their 30s with their families, but they find that their lives are meaningless. And so they do this kind of stuff, they do risky stuff, buy things, they get firstly addicted, then they buy things, some of it is not regulated because things are smuggled in, and then they die. It's not that they're necessarily, everybody's trying to kill themselves, but they indulge in behavior which leads to such horrific consequence for themselves and their families. So to come back to the whole question, there would be changes across the polity because of what China did. They didn't reveal all the facts. If you live in a global village, everybody has got to be totally transparent with each other. The Chinese Communist Party did not do that. There will be some price to be paid for that. And I think the supply chains that American and European companies have depended on, with everything coming from China and India as well, those people will rethink them. There will be more of production within each country, and I think that's very good because doing physical work or work related to manufacturing and production is important for every society. So there would be changes there. So international relationships will change because of technology. I think the particular events of the past few months will be forgotten. But in the meanwhile, what happens to the political systems and the equations between nations, they will change. And I think it is a great opportunity for a nation with the kind of spiritual history and wisdom that India has to find a role which is nearer its soft power, and also exert that power in a helpful way, in a way which helps other nations as well to deal with these unprecedented problems. But at the level of the individual and society, I don't think very much would change. Possibly what would happen is that as jobs disappear, because that cannot be stopped. In fact, people are switching to online ways of working, and a lot of the jobs will be done by machines. And with that, I think the emphasis on large families will go down. People will have fewer families, so that will change the social dynamics, even in countries where there are large families, such as the Middle East and Africa, because India has already reached about 2.3, which is quite close to replacement level. So there will be lasting changes, but in my view, those lasting changes will not be a consequence of the virus. They will be a consequence of the speed up of this process due to technology, which people thought might stretch out over a decade or two. Now, all of that is going to be happening in just a couple of years. And how this speed up would be managed by the elites in various countries is a big challenge, the answers to which we don't know at this particular point.
Very well put, very eloquently put. Dr. Frawley, I must ask this question to you because Professor Kak did mention about the Indian spirituality and wisdom educating the rest of the world. But the essence of this Indian spirituality and wisdom is dharma and an organic society. And that takes me back to my initial question about the whole question of individual anarchy, because this individual rights, because over the years, this individual rights, cultural Marxism, postmodernism, all this has almost taken it to a status of anarchy. Do you think that this kind of a disruption will probably bring a bit of balance to it? And this madness of what we call the mechanistic universe, the old Cartesian theory, will be balanced a little bit or put back or take it back to the original organic theory of dharma?
Thank you, Sanjay. It's good to be with the Jaipur Dialogues again and to see the diversity of topics in depth that you cover with them. And Subash has given a very, as you said, eloquent presentation that has outlined the situation very well. I would like to bring in a few general points. First of all, as Subash said, this is a movement of technology. And we are also now in a world that is becoming more and more ruled by technocrats who know how to establish media, who know how to develop new technology. But a technocrat is not a rishi, a sage, a yogi, even a statesman, even a thinker. And they see technical development as somehow an end in itself. And in that, the human being and the relationship with nature tends to get lost, or at least limited. And we also see this particularly in the medical field, where the drug-based medicine has taken everything over. Drugs not only for childhood diseases of attention issues, but drugs also all the way up to all the psychological disorders, not just simply the physical disorders. Every sort of pain reliever, antidepressant is there. As Subash said, then the opiate crisis comes out of that. And society that's progressively addicted. I also like to speak of the all the media and the even to some extent, I know we're doing this in a positive way, but that we have three types of drugs. We have the recreational drugs. I won't go into all of them, but they're well known. And we have all the medicinal drugs. There's some crossover. And then sometimes there's what I call the drug of choice, the digital drug. So that people have a nervous system that's being constantly wired and stimulated, filled up with music all day long, or at least most of the day. And they've lost their connection with nature, with their own bodies, with their own minds. They don't even know what's going on in their own minds. We are progressively triggered by a media-based politics that's more personality-based, where hating a particular figure becomes more important than actual policies occurring on the ground, or disliking a particular party or disliking a particular ideology. So we do see these continuing problems. Now, what's happened also in the context of this and the coronavirus, not only power to the technocrats, to the media, and to the state and to the government. For example, now we have here, even in our local states, where the governor of a state is restricting or independently deciding what human rights you're going to have for now. There's no legislative process. There is some consensus among different state leaders and among different national leaders, but you're now told you can't go out of your house, or what you can do, or what you can, how you appear, all the rest of it. I'm not even saying this is bad. It may be necessitated by the circumstance, but it is creating an unprecedented power back into the state and also even the local officials that way. And then we have this basic battle that's been going on, the battle between internationalism and nationalism, they say, or between global interest and local interest. And an interesting thing has happened with the virus in that on one level, the internationalist powers have come out almost in a stronger way, in the sense that we have the international medicine. Now you see these big graphs with all the cases, deaths, everything, every day. And then you have the internationalist connections between the different countries, how to address these particular factors. And that we also have the rise of the nationalist thing, because we also know you have to protect your national borders. You need national security, not only on a military level, but now for your food, you may need that. You can't rely on outside countries for your food, even for all your basic things. We have the Society of Internationalism, where to make a plane, one part was made in one country, another part was made in another country, another part in another country, which means if one country goes down, the plane is not made. And that is that international situation is going down. We had all this refugee crisis across the borders. These are also being challenged. So that aspect of internationalism is going down, while state power at a certain level and media power, technology power is also increasing. And there's the look for a magic vaccine rather than looking at our society as a whole. And in the Vedic system, the individual human being is defined relative to nature as part of a greater conscious universe full of life and prana. And the idea of the stage or the society in the traditional Indian sense includes nature, other creatures. It includes respect for different ecosystems. I know with overpopulation in India, there's been a lot of degradation of ecosystems, but it's a very different view. And the view of the human being as not simply a body or even a mind or an intellect, but as a conscious being connected to the greater universe as a whole, and having as a purpose in life some development of consciousness, creativity, art, expression, philosophy, inner thought, and interconnection with higher states of consciousness, deeper perception of nature, connection with other lokas. The human being is not simply physical, but also having connections to higher levels of mind, consciousness, subtle worlds, the universe as a whole. This is also there, and we must keep that in mind. So the Indian system does grant the deeper knowledge and the deeper awareness that is necessary for us to deal with technology from a standpoint of consciousness, rather than being the victims of the technology driven by technocrats, driven by machines, emulating artificial intelligence rather than developing our own awareness, looking to a memory bank on a cell phone or a computer for our knowledge, rather than developing our own deeper memory and awareness. The question is whether the rest of the world will accept this wisdom of India, and even whether India will accept it, given the attacks from the left and the Western media-based influences. But I think it will eventually triumph. It may take some time, but I think that is the future. We have to create this inner science of consciousness, this understanding of the greater cosmic human being, in order to address the technology so it doesn't overwhelm us. And we have to get this inspiration, insight to our leaders and intellectual, academic, media, political leaders. That is not easy, but because they have their vested interest. But I think that is something that can begin, at least in the Indian context. And that is something that even, of course, you're addressing here with this particular discussion that we are having now. So that is my contribution to this particular event.
Professor Kak, as Dr. Frawley says, that ultimately, if we could relate to that human consciousness, then that would be very good. You see this coronavirus thing bringing any kind of greater awareness, at least in the United States, because in India, there's a lot of talk about it, that we need to go back to our dharmic ways. And that is because this is the land of that spirituality, so it is quite natural. But you see the Western societies trying to looking inward and trying to find some kind of connection with this higher consciousness?
Sanjay ji, of course, I do. In fact, you, in your introductory remarks, mentioned quantum mechanics. As we know, quantum mechanics is the most fundamental of all the sciences. And the creator of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger, was an Austrian. was also a Sanatan Dharmi. He always carried the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. And in his own autobiography, he said, the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, gave him the clue to the central concept of quantum mechanics. Now, I mentioned this just to make the point that science, and especially quantum mechanics, now people may not be aware of philosophical overtones associated with it, have transformed the world. Without quantum mechanics, you cannot have chemistry or IC circuits or electronics and chips. And people learn about it this way or the other, or on their own, because education is now a continuous process because of all the technologies that are present. And therefore, ideas of mechanistic world, which you mentioned in the beginning, have already become weak. And people are looking for something deeper which connects us all. Because one of the central notions of quantum mechanics, which according to philosophers is perfectly consistent with Vedanta, one of the ideas there is that of interconnectedness, and also the idea that consciousness is apart from the body. It doesn't emerge from the body. In fact, consciousness is the most frontier science right now, both from the fields of computer science, from physics, from neuroscience. People have looked for it through those disciplines, have not found it. So how to approach it, in my view, will be aided to a great extent by Indian wisdom, because all this has been the central narrative of the Vedas, because the Vedas are Atma Vidya. In fact, in the Vedas, in Vedanta, there's a tradition called Drishti Srishtivad. In all these philosophers got together and said, well, if you have Rit, meaning laws, which govern the outer world, then how come we have freedom? Or how come divinity, Shiva or Vishnu, has freedom? And the response was that there is something called Drishti Srishti, that divinity or consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, creates through Drishti alone. And my good friend, George Sudarshan, one of the great physicists of the past 100 years, who was from India, from Kerala, in fact, who passed away last year, came up with a theory in the 1970s called the quantum Zeno effect, which is nothing but a formulation of Drishti Srishtivad. And it's being tested in the labs, and people are going to win Nobel Prizes for it, where they've shown that just by observation, you can control a system. So a whole new science is on the threshold of being born. And that's where Indian wisdom will, in my view, show the way to everybody. And it's not sectarian, it's universal. We are not saying that you got to do this or that. You know, a practice of sadhana can be rooted in a certain culture, but jnana is universal. And then you can give it different forms so that people can relate to it and then get on this highway, if you will, highway to wisdom, right? So that's what is going to be shown only by India. And not because there's anything individualistic in that, but because India is where rishis for centuries, for millennia, have thought about these matters. And while spiritual issues have also emerged in other cultures and civilizations, but it's not been connected. There's been individuals who talked about these issues or these questions, or even some of the great modern scientists such as Erwin Schrödinger and Heisenberg and many, many others, mathematicians, and some of the greatest Western writers have been inspired by all these ideas. So I think this is going to be India's day. But then what are the challenges? The challenges are that, first of all, Indians generally in their education system are not aware of any of this. And often, as happens, there is something called some effect where bad currency pushes out the good currency. I forget what it's called in economics. So if you don't give all these good ideas to young boys and girls in school and college, then they can get attached to things which are not necessarily the best for the society. So I think that one of the great challenges that India is facing right now is how to introduce all of this in a powerful and wholesome way and form alliances with different groups, because this is truly universal. I don't think one way to stand up and explain it the right way, it should be possible to convert most people, excepting the most blind, to giving it a try. Why not let people know the good news, so to speak? This is the good news. And this could have the potential to change the world for the good out of this great tragedy of the coronavirus. Something wonderful would emerge, not only for India, but for the rest of the world as well.
That's very, very heartening to know, and I'm sure you, being on the Prime Minister's Scientific Technology and Innovation Council, some of these ideas must be getting discussed. I'm very sure, and I look forward to these good times when this universal knowledge could be shared by everybody, and especially to the younger generation in India, because the younger generation somehow has got a sense that not many good things have emerged out of India. In fact, you were one of the pioneers, Professor Kak, who's talked about the history of Indian philosophy and science. I think we will take another session to sometimes discuss the history of Indian philosophy and science, including the different aspects of the Shat Darshanas. This has been a very, very enlightening discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Kak and Dr. Frawley. Thank you very much for joining this discussion.
Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.